Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to my presentation. I will talk about measuring political elite networks with Wikidata, which is part of my dissertation. My name is Omer Yalcin. I'm a PhD candidate at Penn State University. And this is a portion of my dissertation, which has a general theme of studying political elite networks. On my agenda, we'll be first introducing the topic and the key issues that I encounter, then conventional approaches to studying political elite networks, and then the use, or in line with the name of this track, reuse of Wikidata in this project, and then some of the challenges and opportunities I faced when doing this study. So my motivation is to study elite networks, where elites are defined as people who can substantially and regularly influence political outcomes in a country. And what makes them networks is the study of the relationship between the elite actors. The questions that can be answered using or by studying elite networks are, for example, who are the competing factions in a political system among the elites? Is the network centralized around one individual, or is it decentralized? Which actors occupy important positions in the network, as measured by their centrality in the network, for example? What impact does this have on regime outcomes? These are all important questions in political science that can be answered using elite networks. And when we think about networks of elites, every network is made up of a collection of nodes and ties. And of course, they're also called graphs in mathematics and computer science. In this case, in the case that I have, nodes are individual elite actors, and ties are things like kinship, friendship, co-attendance at a school together, co-religion, sharing the same religion, or it could be many other things. The problem is studying elite networks in a comparative fashion. In this picture, you see elites in very different contexts. So here, this is from the Soviet Union, Stalin with members of the Politburo. This is the parliament in Ghana. Here you have Pope with bishops. And here you have the military, members of the military in Thailand. The important thing to consider here is that these are all very different groups of people, but in their own unique context, they matter a lot for that country's politics. The military in Thailand is very influential in deciding how that country will be governed, but there are other countries, especially countries that have long democratic traditions, the military would not have any say in how politics works. And so the idea is elites differ a lot by context. The people of interest, whether they're legislators, generals, clergy, etc., change. So the nodes are very different, as well as the ties of interest, kinship, co-attendance, co-religion, as I mentioned. They're very different from context to context. This restriction, this is the reason why in conventional studies, a lot of restriction is required. For this reason, many studies focus on one or just a few countries, a single institution within those countries, and then they use survey or archival data. Some of the examples include the study of Chinese elites using the ruling party's central committee, the Chinese Communist Party's central committee, as an example, or in a study. And also, there's a study, for example, on parliaments in Ghana and Togo using survey data. So this type of a study requires the researcher to go to those countries, arrange meetings with parliamentarians, and ask questions about them, about their relationships to other parliamentarians. So it requires a lot of restrictions because it is very expensive. So it cannot be done in lots of countries, or it cannot be done on multiple institutions within that country. Again, many studies on legislative networks in US Congress, they use archival data, and it's also a lot more expensive than the option that I will present with Wikidata. So before going on to the use of Wikidata, what can we do if we are to study elite networks across many countries? We need a couple of things. One, we need information on all countries. So all countries around the globe. We need information on elites from different institutions like the parliament, cabinet, military, and we need information on lots of different kinds of ties, kinship, co-attendance, etc. Now, in this study, I focus on kinship ties, but as we know, Wikidata is able to produce all of those other ties as well. So why is Wikidata a good solution to this type of a problem? One is Wikidata already has an inherent graph structure. It has nodes in the form of items, and there are ties or edges in the form of properties that connect those items. Item, property, value triplets that we are all familiar with. It has information on all countries, and it allows the integration of local knowledge because everyone can contribute to it. It also has information on all sectors, such as parliament, military, governors, militia leaders, etc. So Wikidata is a really good source to tackle this kind of a problem. So what I do as portion of my research is to use Wikidata in an application to what I call dynastic politics. There is a hypothesis, an implicit hypothesis in political science that expects authoritarianism to be linked to kinship ties among the elite. The reason why this would be expected is because there are frequent coups in authoritarian countries, and as a coup-proofing tactic, as a way of preventing coups, authoritarian leaders tend to install trusted relatives, people they have kinship ties to, in important positions of power. If that is the case, then in countries that are more authoritarian, there should be a lot more denser kinship ties among the elite. So to test this hypothesis, I use Wikidata's query system and look up each UN member country. And for each country that is a member of the United Nations, I query instances of humans who are citizens of the country in question, who were born after 1900, January 1, 1900, who have a value for their position-held property, thinking that this position-held property would be an indicator of elite status, meaning they have held an important societal position. The position is in the same country, and after getting a universe of people that I want to study for each country, the kinship ties, the properties of kinship that link them. And for kinship properties, I looked at another Wikidata item called Wikidata Property for Human Relationships that lists all these relationships or properties such as sibling, mother, father, etc. I excluded only number of children because that obviously doesn't link one person to another. It links a person to a number. To give an example of the type of data that I get, here I plotted the largest component of the United States network that I produced. A component of a graph is a subset of nodes where each pair of nodes within it has a path between them. So here, the largest component within the US network is part of the Kennedy family, which is a famous political family in the United States. And it has 9 nodes, and all of these people have a position-held property, and they have some linkage of a mother, father, sibling, etc. In contrast, this is the largest component of the Saudi Arabia network, which shows part of the Saudi Arabian royal family. Because Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, and because this type of kinship relationship is built into how the country is governed, we see that we have a lot more people in the largest component, and we have a lot more dense relationships among them. And this is here, the blue nodes are the king and current crown prince of Saudi Arabia. To show a global outlook of how the data looks like, the query returned about 220,000 people from all 193 members of the United Nations, and about 60%, close to 60% of them have a birthplace coordinate recorded in Wikidata, and I plotted them onto this map. Like a lot of maps that are produced with data from Wikidata, we can see an important concentration in Europe and North America, but still we can say that the data is pretty global. There is information on all 193 member countries of the UN, which is pretty good. And then the relationship that I'm looking into, which is the relationship between authoritarianism and prevalence of kinship ties. Here, what I plot is on the x-axis polity scores, which are commonly used to look into how democratic a country is, where a score of 10 indicates very democratic and a score of -10 indicates very autocratic. And on the y-axis, I have the mean degree, which means the average number of ties to other elite actors, other actors that have held a position that a person in that country has in the data. And what we see is there is, in fact, a negative relationship between polity scores and mean degree, which means the average person in authoritarian countries has more ties to other elite members, more kinship ties, more relativity ties than people in democratic countries. Now, briefly, I will talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that I saw during this study. So this map is a better indicator of coverage than the previous map because it takes into consideration political boundaries. And what we see here is the number of actors, the number of people that were returned in the queries for that country as divided by that country's population. And these colors are on a log scale. And as we suspected in that other map, and it's common knowledge that Europe is a lot better covered than different parts of the world. Canada is well covered, etc., but there are places that are really, really dark, which means we really have, at least in this specific domain, few data points about people who have held positions of power. Okay. So another issue that I encounter, and this is just an example, is that when I query instances of humans who are citizens of United Nations members, in Wikidata, Denmark is not a UN member because the Danish realm, Denmark plus Denmark's territories like Greenland that make up that entity are a UN member. However, politicians in Denmark, like their prime minister, is recorded as a citizen of Denmark, but not of Danish realm. So when I make a query that looks for people who are elite actors, people who have held positions in UN member countries, we don't really get a lot of data on Denmark. So this is an example of where things can go unexpectedly in such a data collection process. However, this made me think that despite the coverage differences, Wikidata is a lot more accessible globally than academic knowledge production because the alternatives that I mentioned involve people essentially monopolizing knowledge production because they sit down, a couple of people, and produce knowledge. Whereas, so there is even more inequality in coverage in that type of model than Wikidata. And also, anyone being able to edit, like in the example that I showed, obviously people can't agree on things, so there are differences in terms of how people enter data. And this makes information accumulation possible, but also makes these types of challenges arise. In conclusion, Wikidata helps answer questions that are otherwise not answerable. That hypothesis that I talked about, it is really difficult to test that globally, whether authoritarianism is linked to kinship tie density or the average number of kinship ties. That's really difficult to test with any other data source. Incorporation of local knowledge, like in Wikidata, is also very difficult to attain. Otherwise, there is currently a coup or a military government in Myanmar, for example, and it's difficult to get information out. But something like Wikidata makes it possible, at least, that information is provided by someone who is familiar with the local context, as opposed to someone sitting in the US or somewhere else and just making an educated guess. And projects like the Wiki Project, Every Politician, is really helping address these types of gaps. Thank you for listening, and you can reach out to me on my website or using Twitter. Thank you. I see some comments, so maybe I can go through those. Weren't all French mayors, or was all mayors of a different country important at some point? Definitely massive amount of data on French mayors. Yeah, it's. Oh, wait, yeah, I think it seems definitely that there's something going on with France and the data that they have, because in that map, France is the one that has the largest amount of people returned per capita. So that does seem to be the case. And of course, now this is a Wikidata conference, but the point kind of my study was in a political science and academic context, showing that even data that hasn't been collected by a few researchers based on archival data, to make sure everything is precise and everything is accounted for, every missing thing is recorded, etc. Even such a data can still be useful, in fact, more useful in some ways, in its current form, right, Wikidata, instead of excluding something manually. I only did one manual intervention, which was to include Denmark as a UN member, to get all of that data about Denmark. I guess ML and clustering could help doing this. Have you tested the export data to it? I feel they have this now for J. I haven't done that, no. Exporting to Neo4j. But that might be a good idea, though. Do we have other questions or comments? I see people typing. Yeah, what's next for my research? Well, that's an interesting question. So I study typically elite networks in different contexts using different data sources. And what I'm really interested in with regard to Wikidata is its ability to disambiguate between entities. So I use a lot of text data, and especially the aliases that Wikidata provides in different languages to disambiguate between different ways of referring to the same people is something that I'm currently working on, especially I work with Arabic text data, And when there are different ways of referring to the same person in the same text, I want to be able to say, okay, this is actually the same person, even though for the computer, it's different strings. So that's something that I'm working with. TIE are the honor award received, not all award, but certain are a defined cluster of power. Yeah, so one thing that I didn't go into the detail of was, because the theory is about how authoritarianism would require kinship ties, I actually collected all the properties that connect people and then separated kinship ties from other ties to show that kinship ties are in fact statistically significantly related to authoritarianism, but all of the other ties, when I look at them, they're not related to authoritarianism. So in order to show that it is in fact, the hypothesis is in fact holding. Was there anything you were missing from Wikidata that you wished was included on Wikidata for your research? I think the thing that, so I consider myself an amateur user of Wikidata. So there might be things that I think are missing, but they're in fact available. So I should speak with that caveat. I guess just the differences in it's not missing from because of Wikidata itself, but rather just the differences in internet penetration rates around the globe and access to these types of technologies creates a lot of imbalance in the data, creates a lot of missingness. So I definitely wish, and I think that's relevant for all types of Wikidata projects. Just the more complete the data, the better it is. So I think if, for example, data from places like Brunei, Myanmar, Somalia, that are not covered very well around the globe, if they were covered better, if they had complete information, then that would, of course, make things a lot easier. And I guess that's an answer to the other question as well. What kind of improvements in Wikidata could help get better results? Where the main gaps in data were in the countries which had less? Is it that the people don't exist at all, or don't know which positions they have held, or the positions are modeled well enough to know they're in that country, or family ties aren't modeled as well in some countries than others? I'm not very sure, but I think definitely the issue starts with not having all of the people, all of the relevant people from that country. So that's the beginning of the problem. So I remember looking at Ghana, for example, because I was comparing to another study. And at the time that I was looking, a lot of the parliamentarian members of parliament weren't recorded. So I think that's where it starts. And another thing is, when something is missing, it's difficult to know if it's just missing or if it doesn't exist. Like maybe the person doesn't have a sibling, but I don't know if the person doesn't have a sibling or is it just not recorded. So that's the kind of difficult part, I guess. These are great comments. Thank you all a lot, by the way. How I heard about Wikidata, I completely, a couple of years ago, just happened to click on a Wikidata item link on a Wikipedia article. And then I Googled it. I looked through YouTube to kind of watch some tutorials on how to do the queries. And then I found myself incorporating into my research, and I'm trying to do it as much as I can going forward. Thank you. Thanks a lot for the comments, Shani and John, and all the others. I think we're almost out of time. Thank you, everyone.